Hey guys, Nick here with Picture This, and today we are going to be talking about the 3 most important things that the beginner photographers should know. So, without further ado, let's jump straight into the video. So, some of you who clicked on this video who aren't beginners, or maybe some of you are, but those of you who have clicked on this video are probably thinking, what is he going to talk about? Or if you are a little bit more experienced, you probably know what I'm going to be talking about. So, the 3 topics we are going to be talking about are ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, the 3 components of the exposure triangle. So, let's just start off with aperture. So, aperture is how wide open the actual aperture on the lens is. So it's basically the hole that lets the light in and lets the camera expose and do what it needs to do to take your images. So the way an f-stop works, which is your aperture number, is your f-stop number, is the higher the number, the smaller the hole is. So the more closed the aperture is, the higher the number. So like f22, f16, your aperture is really small. And then if you have like a f2, f2.8, f1.4 type of thing, your aperture is really big. And that allows for lots of light to come in. So if you want to shoot some low light or something like that, you want your aperture to be nice and wide and open. So for example, right now I'm shooting at an f4 right now, and like the background's kind of out of focus. So that's another thing that aperture does, is the lower your f-stop, the more out of focus the background is, like the shallower the depth of the field. So if I adjust it right now, you could just click it like that, go boop, 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 boop. Also, since it's getting smaller, you can't really see me because the hole is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and it's closing off the light. So just in general, I guess you could see kind of like in this area, things are just more in focus, I guess. It's really hard to see though. There we go. So we're back at f4, and I'm properly exposed as I should be, and things are a little bit out of focus. But if I was shooting like a f1.8, f2, something like that, this would be like almost totally blown out, almost, because I'm still like relatively far away from the camera. But anyway, that is a quick little explanation of aperture, and now we're gonna move into ISO. So the way ISO works is it's your camera's sensitivity to light. So if I have ISO of like 100 or something, it's not that sensitive to light. And then as I keep bumping it up, it's gonna get more and more sensitive to like ISO 1600, 3200, and you just keep going up. So for example, if I'm shooting outside, I don't want a really high ISO number, because there's plenty of light outside and it'll just cause me to get grainy images or overexposed images too. And then since I'm inside right now, I'm shooting at ISO 640, which is kind of like a middle ground, I guess you could say, between like 100 and something you'd use to shoot in a more darker situation. So if it's really dark, you could go to like 1600, 3200, something like that. But unless you have like a really new camera or even a full frame camera that can handle those higher ISOs and deal with the noise a little bit better, I wouldn't go maybe higher than like 3200, or at least I don't really, because I don't like that much noise in my images. And then you could also do noise reduction and stuff like that, but I prefer to get as close as I can in camera to what I want, because sometimes the post-processing doesn't go exactly how I'd like. So I did briefly mention full frame cameras, and you're probably thinking, what's the difference between ISO and a crop sensor or a full frame? So I'm glad you asked. So ISO on a full frame camera, since the sensor is bigger, it actually allows more light to get in, which means it'll handle higher ISOs and just low light better in general, as compared to my crop sensor 80D here. But since it is a fairly new camera, its processor is very good and it'll handle the low ISOs pretty well. So we're gonna wrap this up and try to make this really short for you guys, and we'll go straight into shutter speed. So the way shutter speed works is the faster your shutter speed, so like the bigger number under the 1, so like 1 over 1,000, 1 over 2,000, that type of thing, is like faster, you're gonna freeze that motion. So if you're trying to shoot someone running or shooting sports or something like that, you want to do like 1/1000th or something because they're moving really, really fast. But if you have a still subject or something like that, you could shoot like 1/25th, 1/125th, 1/50, something like that. Like if you have a stabilized lens, you could shoot 1/50 and probably be fine. But yeah, I don't really see a huge need to go over that. But if you have a creative reason for it, or if it's really bright outside and you can only stop down so much and you want the depth of field, then yeah, you could turn your shutter speed up a little bit and it's not like a super big deal. The only reason why shutter speed is important, I think, for if you're shooting like outside or something like that, is for video. So if you're shooting 24 frames per second, you usually want to follow the 180 shutter rule, and you want to keep the shutter speed double what your frame rate is. And that's when shutter speed is important, because I'm shooting 24 frames per second right now, and I'm shooting 1/50th. So if I crank it up, like it'll completely change like the motion blur, and it's gonna look all weird. And then if I go back to 1/50th, the motion blur looks normal, and that's what we want, because when it was at 1/200th and the motion blur was all weird, it just looked unnatural and gross and bad. So the reason why it's called the exposure triangle is because each element plays off of each other. You've got your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter speed, and they're just all on a triangle because they just each play off of each other. So if you want to maintain an f4 aperture and maintain correct exposure, you have to adjust your ISO and your shutter speed accordingly. And then that goes the same with shutter speed. If I want to maintain a 1/50th shutter speed, I want to keep my f4 aperture and adjust my ISO accordingly, so that way I can maintain my 1/50th shutter speed for my 180 shutter rule. And then same with ISO. I mean, I usually set that last because I set my shutter speed that I want to use, set my aperture that I want to use, and then if I'm still under or over, that's when I'll adjust my ISO. Usually that's not the first thing I touch, because it's just like minute adjustments at that point. So I hope you guys enjoyed this short little video about the exposure triangle. Again, this is more aimed for beginners or maybe experienced people that just want to brush up on their skills. But if you guys want to see more beginner tutorials or just more photo and video like tutorials and skills-based videos, let me know down below. Also, make sure to like, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.